Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I'm Desi. I'm the former Chief Innovation Advisor. I recently stepped down from my position within the government agency to now work with innovators all around the world deploying in disasters. So thanks again for joining us. We're going to quickly do some introductions we never have enough space. There's always too many computers and never enough space. But we're going to do quick introductions. I'll just introduce myself really quick, tell you a little bit about my background. I'm going to turn it back over to Willow to have a conversation about how she came to be, and then we're going to talk about how we met and what we've been doing since. So with that, like I said, former Chief Innovation Advisor. Just a little bit of background on me. I came from the Urban Area Security Initiative that was very regional. It was Homeland Security based after experiencing a school shooting. So I've spent my life, actually my career in emergency management, but only recently did I get into natural disasters. And it was after a large flooding incident in a city in Wisconsin where citizens weren't getting the assistance they needed. In fact, the federal declaration did not go through. And many of the survivors and the citizens were left kind of penniless, and their homes were destroyed. So that was my little adventure into the natural disaster world. And from that, with some innovators and some non-governmental forces and volunteers, we actually went into the communities. We overturned the declaration. It was a federally declared declaration after we sent in the reports. It went up to the White House, and that city was then given $50 million, $40 million for individual assistance, first directly to citizens, and then another $10 million to public assistance for bridges and roadways. So that was my little leap from being only in man-made disasters, but then moving into the natural disaster space. From there, I kept doing things to actually get myself fired, and which I don't recommend it, but I do think it's an interesting thing when you find yourself constantly rubbing up against some of the things you're supposed to be doing, because maybe it says that you're meant to amplify what you are doing. It's creating some waves. So from there, I got picked up from FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We worked together to look at ways to create transparency in the agency, but also bring some of the really creative, innovative things happening that were happening at these organic levels, allow them to live, grow, and breathe, but see if there's a way to connect it with this very formal sector of government. And so I spent the past year with the agency doing that, and I'm not going to give it away, but Willow and I and several of our teammates have gone to several federally declared disasters to deploy innovation into the field.
So I'm Willow Brugh. I am with an organization called Geeks Without Bounds, which is an accelerator for humanitarian projects. We do a lot of these hackathons or code sprints or what have you, where people with technical skill sets can do what our friend George called speed dating between developers and organizations who might benefit from their assistance. And while the weekends are great and they're high intensity and they build a lot of community, the projects don't tend to go anywhere. And so what we do is provide 6 months of mentorship in business development, in how to pitch, in human rights, in security, so that some of these projects can see the light of day. And one of our recent successes is in Bangalore, India, with a distress app that works on the infrastructure of India, the telecom structure. So that's super exciting. And this high exposure rate to a lot of different groups and a lot of different grassroots innovations that come out of anywhere means that I got to go and hang out and do some good work out in the field. I also tend to herd kittens. Those are cats, I promise, where in a group of people I try to get them to cohese in some way and behave as a group, which is funny when you start to join up the formal and the informal. So this is who we are. We've just done that, very exciting. What we do, we're gonna get into next. What it looks like in the field and how it ends up, because having a closed loop, it's very important. The main thing that we're gonna talk about and what we aimed for is what is the experience like for the affected population. Do you wanna talk about that?
I don't know how many, maybe we should do a raise of hands. How many folks have survived a natural or man-made disaster, at least experienced one, even if your home wasn't destroyed? Raise your hands high, because I just want to see. That's a significant amount of folks. And I did too. And so you know what it's like. And especially if your home is demolished. I actually happened to be a new homeowner at the time that I experienced my first natural disaster. But even a step back, I remember when I experienced a school shooting back when I was in law school. So we all know we have those images kind of ingrained in our heads. And so when it comes to looking at what the experience for the affected population, if you haven't experienced something like that, I'm sure you know somebody who has, and try to put yourselves in the shoes of that person as we had this conversation about our deployment into the field to innovate.
And we want to give credit also to John Crowley, who's amazing, and we're sad he's not here right now, who's on our innovation team, and also Eric Rasmussen, who's amazing. But John is the one who came up, or the first one that I heard the phrase formal and informal come from. So credit where it's due, props are yes. Okay, so first we're going to tell you about Sandy response. Who goes first? People are in the dark. Look at them. They're so stressed out. They don't know about power or if their house is on fire or where their loved ones are. So one of the things that happens is that when people are confused, a lot of it is because there's no transparency about what different groups are about. We're really bad about telling other people what we're up to. We're so busy doing it that we don't take the time to broadcast. And so one of the things that has happened is that nobody knew in Sandy what FEMA is supposed to do. We saw a bunch of signs that said, like, where is FEMA? They should be coming to help. Are they going to dig out my house? All this other stuff. And so I drew this thing of, you have a city that talks to the county, that talks to the state, and then the state gets to talk to FEMA, and then FEMA deploys into the field. And a lot of people think that FEMA is there to remove dirt, and they're there to write checks mostly, and now they do some other things as well. And just being transparent about this and saying, like, look, we know you have a bunch of needs, but we need to figure out who does each of those things. Is it Office of Emergency Management? Is it who's going to take care of these things? One amazing innovation that happened was with this thing called Map Mill, which we describe as hot or not for disaster response, where Civil Air Patrol takes off and they take a bunch of picture out of the left-hand side of the window behind the pilot, and then Skylar Earl and Rob, I think, loaded into this program called Map Mill, where people can just click through and say, it's super damaged, it's okay, or it's all right. And then you do analysis across all of the different responses that you get, and you end up with a map of where damage is. And then people in official response can show up to an area and say, we haven't gotten your paperwork yet, but it looks like it's really messed up here. Can you sign here? And we have all the trucks, which is amazing.
Before, I just want to kind of highlight a really important point about this whole crowdsourcing with photos and imagery. First of all, this is an amazing way to democratize information, right? We talk about lateralizing it. I know Willow's a big fan of that. I'm a big fan as well. But the other thing to note that this all started at a very local urban area security initiative where there was a group of organic, there was an organic group forming. Now, they didn't actually come up with the idea to fly over and do the imagery, but they did have an idea about damage assessment. And you might note that if you have a disaster that occurs in your neighborhood, and you're able to actually get that information uploaded, you feel somewhat a part of the process, and there's a sense of instilled empowerment, right? Because you're a part of this now, and you're not just having to sit back and wait. You get to be a part of proactively engaging. So with that, we're going to talk a little social media here. And I am going to also pivot on this one with Willow because there was a very interesting synergy between what we were doing at the federal level with what was going on with Geeks Without Bounds and then a private sector partner named Splunk. So to kind of start out, we held daily calls. So our team deployed down to Sandy. We had Willow, myself, John, Eric, a bunch of guys came down and we're hanging out. And actually one of Willow's friends, Makerspace, because we were not allowed yet to officially be in the Joint Field Office or a Disaster Recovery Center. We hadn't built street cred to go there yet. So we had to come up with some areas that were challenges that government and citizens faced. And one of those areas was in social media. So we would get on this daily call, and the White House would get on FEMA External Affairs, you name it, FEMA Response, but then a whole cadre of non-governmental partners came on this call. And what was really quite neat about the call that we had, particularly in the beginning stages, was the rumor control issues that we were experiencing. There were so many different thoughts about what we were doing on the ground and what FEMA was doing and other first responders that we as a group, as well as the ones that were responding, were finding that citizens weren't aware where we were. And part of the reason was we had a huge surge capacity, which I'm going to let Willow talk about, and the whole idea of voice amplifier. But Splunk partnered with Geeks Without Bounds to accept a donation and then allowed everyone to see what the public sentiment looked like during Hurricane Sandy. And some of this, of course, we couldn't collect right away, but individually we were able to get day-by-day look at how people were feeling, what we needed as ground truth, and if there were trends in how folks were feeling. And that actually helped us innovate to figure out how we could better serve populations. It's also important to note, besides Splunk, we had the Canadians helping us, which is another first. So a lot of times, you know, we go overseas, but we are not overseas, maybe just over the border. I'm from Wisconsin, so it's really right next door to me. But needless to say, we had Canadians coming in virtually to also help us look at social media analytics and big data problems. And that was a really interesting bridge to have a FEMA federal agency, a chief innovation advisor, and then Canadians from another country coming in and helping us. So just a neat whole of community approach.
So voice amplification also goes into people who follow the Twitter feeds and social media in general that have to do with FEMA and other groups are a very select group of people that already understand FEMA to some degree and care to follow it. And it builds up its own little silo. I didn't have time to draw the social media map, but it tends to be its own little bubble. And so by including people like Galit and myself and some other fine folk who are entrenched in a very different demographic, when we said, look, things are actually okay, or this is happening over here, or whatever else, or when we were honest about what was going wrong, it made for a much more honest conversation that happened in a wider group of people. Other forms of communication have to do with satellite uplinks and how people are communicating. So usually when your entire system goes down, people will bring in, which one? Okay, so when new comms are brought in, it's always to the official disaster recovery center. So it's usually in a parking lot that is big enough for all of the trucks and trailers and everything else to be in, right? Because you need space to set it up. That's not where people tend to be. The communities have already set up their own in churches, in high schools, and whatever else, because that's where they feel comfortable. That's where they already are. And then we come in and set up and expect them to go somewhere else that's difficult to get to, and they don't understand. Like it's just language that I won't use right now. And so,
Exclamation.
yes. And so one of the reasons that that this plays out the way it does is because there aren't satellite comms or telecommunication links in any way in the community ones. And so we help to set that up by installing VSATs. And then you have the ability to communicate in the place where people already are. So what happens in these disaster recovery centers is, first of all, people have a difficult time finding them, just period, like where they are on a map, and you have to pamphlet places, and then you deal with rumors of where they are and where they aren't, and it's a cluster. And then once members of the affected population get to an area, they have trouble understanding the layout of the space. What that looks like is this. You have a Red Cross table set up next to a group that's handing out debit cards for recovery next to the FEMA table. People aren't talking about what line they're standing in, so there's a whole lot of confusion. And they're standing out in like the sun, and they're not sure what's happening with their house because they can't see it because it's in this parking lot. And the people who do know what's going on are, of course, not directing lines and setup because they're doing other things. then what happens is when you figure out what line you're going to stand in, is you stand in that line for about 60 minutes. To sit on a phone for 45 minutes with a 40% drop rate. Also, I'm super pleased with this stick figure sitting and talking on the phone. Art of stick figures, thank you. And you're talking to someone on the other end of the line who's filling in a database because they're certified to do that. Like, we can do this better, right? And part of the reason why that ended up the way it is because of where the connection points are. And so we looked at, from a design perspective, what is going on. And people are already standing around at charging stations, charging their phones. So while they're doing that, why not just have them fill out forms via iPad, because you have the uplink where they are, and that person can still be certified to do that and take personally identified information. And if you set it up such that it's a community recovery center, they're able to self-organize around what they want for their group. You just provide them space to do that.
If you can imagine right now, the field innovation team's on the ground, the hurricane has swirled, it has gone, Sandy had her date and she's now left, and now we are faced with all these challenges. So as Willow explained, we had social media analytics and analysis and sentiment going. Now you have to understand how big it is for a government agency to be working with non-governmental agencies in a disaster. They hadn't worked together beforehand, besides us having a friendship and knowing each other. That was it. They are now working in the midst of the second most expensive disaster in US history. So you have to understand how just wide scale and big this really is. Not to add that all of our innovation team is sprawled across from Red Hook to Far Rockaway to Brooklyn to Manhattan, you name it. So we have a massive effort going on, a very small but highly skilled group going out and deploying. So it's really important to just get an understanding of this background. So back to the DRCs though. So you've got public sentiment analysis. People are listening to us. They're actually looking at that. But then we have the DRCs rethinking and redesigning it. So along with Willow and John and all kinds of other innovators on our innovation team who were observing, we also deployed a German-based company of designers to come out and view what was going on the ground. So they not only also joined our team to look at the physical flow of survivors, we thought there's also got to be some mobile registration going. So our deputy administrator of FEMA, he's number 2 at the agency, his name is Rich. Pretty cool guy. Yeah, he is. He's let us do some things that you know, I think there was a time when we were sitting in the National Response and Coordination Center and he said, Desi, I hired you just a few months ago. My rules for you are do not break the law. I happen to be a lawyer, so I'm big on let's not break the law. But the second thing he said, but you better take a blowtorch to that red tape. So it was like, okay, we've got to do this really quick and really fast, and we knew that we had a big challenge on our hands. So, oh, do you have something to say, Willow?
Mesh networks.
Let's catch that. So just toggling back to the DRC, beyond just doing what we could do in Hurricane Sandy, we then subsequently held design workshops in New York City, and we have looked at catalyzing and creating a much more effective experience so that the survivor feels like they're being tailored to. So not only are we going out and registering them mobilely, which we did in the disaster, and not only are we creating it so we're registering them on iPads in the centers, we've also looked at plans and blueprints to have us within the centers work individually with those survivors, and they work with just one person. Now that's not been developed completely wide scale yet, but we do have these disaster survivor assistance teams that FEMA's continued to mobilize with. And like I said, I am the former Chief Innovation Advisor as of last week, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the agency. I just realized I keep doing things in present tense. Let's move to mesh networks though. This is a really interesting one, and I'm gonna hand it over to Willow.
And one of the things that we saw happen during Sandy response was there's an area called Red Hook, and there was the Red Hook initiative, which was an ongoing community engagement effort to get kids in high school to figure out how to run a mesh. And so they had their points on the top of buildings. And what happened was when every other line went down because the lines are severed, they were still able to communicate in their area, which is amazing. And there are all sorts of things, like the local ISP was willing to let them run that, and there are all sorts of policy issues that I find fascinating that we'll go into right now. But some of the mesh kids from DC, Hack DC, which is a hackerspace down there, drove all the way up to help build out this network so that more people could use it. And so it's not just about getting the first responders and the official people the ability to communicate, it's about everybody being able to communicate. Because if the purpose of us going in is to help people and let them be in a better place, then we should often just let them do that on their own and back them up with whatever they need. So it was really cool to see that happen. I would like to see more mesh in more places. Or at least the ability to do that. We're starting that again in Cambridge. It's happening really strongly in Detroit. It's starting here in San Francisco or up in San Francisco.
It's just important to notice that it's government, non-government working together. So the mesh networks that were put up by the team and by the Open Tech Institute, OTI, yes, with Georgia Bolin and Jonathan Baldwin, that was really important because obviously survivors and community members could communicate out then. But we also used it to power our disaster recovery centers. With that, let's move to the White House. Yes, so this was pretty intense. Our team, in the midst of just over a month in Sandy, had done some pretty prolific things. Changing policy, moving people out of medieval stages into the Enlightenment era, and doing some things that we had never done in a disaster before as well. So at least I think on U.S. soil, but I'd have to ask Willow to confirm that. But needless to say, the White House said, this is really neat. You guys did a lot of great stuff and you rock. So we ran a think tank. And we invited our field innovation team along with former Secretary Napolitano. She was the Department of Homeland Security Secretary. We had Rich Serino, Deputy Administrator, facilitating the call. We had Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, you name it, like all these federal agencies acknowledging this very organic, informal group that went out and innovated in disasters. Now, if that's not big enough, this actually had ripple effects internationally because there is a bit of a stigma and a belief, and you may know about this, but a lot of folks don't believe in a lot of wide-scale innovation in a disaster. Well, as you know, we absolutely debunked that theory. I mean, in Sandy, and then we continue to do it with whether it was the Oklahoma tornadoes, the Boston bombing with the marathons, you name it. But that's the whole thing. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience at the White House?
Oh my God. There are all sorts of things that I'd love to tell you when I'm not on recording, but it was fascinating because, you know, as you might be able to tell, this was a very strange thing for me. But because I care about how we start to systematize the things that work in the informal sector, and how we take what has worked in the ad hoc and make it usual. Like, how do we transmit information? How do we transmit what works in a non-hierarchical sense? And so being in this situation and meeting with such respect with people that I really have a lot of respect for was incredible. And it showed that it wasn't just lip service. It wasn't just using something in the moment when it worked and seeing these communities that I'm a part of as free labor or as access points or whatever else, but as a coming together as equals was incredibly meaningful to me.